I just want to welcome you guys to Love Your Library 2014. This is King for a Day, Laurence King Publishing Day at FIT. My name's Leslie Preston. I'm the head of acquisitions here in our library. Today we're pleased to have three Laurence King fashion authors with us today. Dean Rhys Morgan will kick us off with his talk about legendary fashion illustrator and FIT alum Tony Viramontes, followed by FIT's Assistant Dean, Sass Brown. She's going to be speaking about upcycled and repurposed fashion, so stick around for that. And then lastly, Carolyn Kiesel will demonstrate several draping demos from her book at 6 o'clock. As you can see, she's starting to set up over there. Our Barnes & Noble at FIT Bookshop will be open during the whole event, and you can also try to put in for a raffle to win a fashion book collection, so don't forget that. That's over on the table over here. But before we get started with Dean, I wanted to quickly introduce Patricia Kwan. She's the publicist for Laurence King Publishing, and she will then introduce Dean, who will be speaking next. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Patricia. I work for Laurence King out of San Francisco. We are a London-based publisher known for producing inventive, beautifully designed, and authoritative books on the creative arts. Before we get started with our talk, I really wanted to thank our friends at FIT for hosting us this year and helping us pull together this event. We're really honored to be a part of FIT's Love Your Library Week. We have a really wonderful lineup this evening. Our first speaker studied costume design before becoming a journalist, reporting on fashion and interiors. He now runs his own online gallery, specializing in mid-century fashion and interior illustration. His book, Bold, Beautiful, and Damned, which you might have seen last year in the Fashion Week windows at Bergdorf's, celebrates the work and life of visionary 80s fashion illustrator and FIT alum, as Leslie mentioned, Tony Viramontes. So please join me in welcoming Dean Rhys Morgan.
Hello, everyone. Before I begin, I should probably confess that I never actually met Tony Viramontes. He died in Los Angeles in 1988 while I was actually still a student in the darkest depths of Wales. But it was in this most unlikely of settings that I first discovered his work. It was the sleeve art he created for Arcadia's So Red the Rose that first piqued my interest. I can still remember buying this album, discarding the record, and pinning the sleeve on my wall. Though to my shame, I don't really think I paid much attention as to who might have created this extraordinary image. But time moved on, and it wasn't until the late 90s that I rediscovered Tony while flipping through some old issues of Le Mode en Pointure at my college library. To my delight, I discovered page after page of the most sweeping hedonistic images, stashed between modern painters and radio times. But who could have created such dazzling images? Gradually, I connected the record sleeve I'd admired years earlier with the subject of my most recent passion. But who was this Tony Viramontes, and where was he now? With great gusto, I set out to discover more about the man behind the drawings, but to my disappointment, little was known about this master of descripted line who captured the pulse of the 1980s so effortlessly. Overshadowed during his lifetime by his friend and mentor, Antonio Lopez, Tony Viramontes had gradually and unaccountably slipped from view. The advent of the internet, Facebook, and blogging occasionally brought forth a few new images or an anecdote, but most of the published material I discovered was biographically thin, anecdotal, and often simply inaccurate. I also suspected there might be more drawings out there, but where were they? Thwarted, I put away the magazines and more time passed. Then in October 2010, while working on another project with another illustrator, I struck up an email correspondence with Tony's older brother, Ed Viramontes. If you ever find yourself in Los Angeles, I would love to show you my brother's work, he wrote. Well, what to do? I went, I saw, and I was conquered. In an age of computer-generated everything, drawing has for some time been considered a laughably anachronistic medium. But today I'm pleased to say it's enjoying a resurgence. As someone who can barely hold a brush, I've always had a passion for the painted page. And there are certain artists whose personas inform their work and make it immediately recognizable. Tony's work, despite a variety of visual idioms, always bore an unmistakable hallmark. Whether in carefully controlled brush strokes, line drawings, or subtle washes of color, or bold elemental brushstrokes, whatever the technique, the handwriting was always uniquely Viramontes. As I worked my way through hundreds of pieces of artwork, all carefully preserved by Ed and his family, I became aware of the breadth and richness of Tony's short career. His output was staggering. For every approved or published drawing he made, there might be 10 or 12 alternatives. Additionally, there were piles of old newspapers and magazine clippings, sketchbooks, photographs, correspondence, and diaries. Tony left quite a trail. And while his diaries were neither chronological nor particularly literary, they nevertheless constitute a strong personal document in which he recorded his many observations on his own character and achievements that would eventually provide the foundations for Bold, Beautiful, and Damned. While the intention of my book was never to set out a definitive biographical study of Tony Viramontes and his work, my hope is that it provides a clear introduction to the people he knew and the work he produced during his short but prolific career. For Tony was well enough known in his own lifetime to become the voice of countless magazine and advertorial pages, yet his celebrity lasted just as long as his work continued to appear in print. When it ceased to appear, the name Viramontes was quickly forgotten and the world moved on. A presumptuous exhibition of his work in Paris in October 1999 was his sole memorial. Many of his drawings have since disappeared or fallen into anonymity. Some of his sketches passed into the collections of his friends and acquaintances, a few were sold to collectors, and some made their way into the archives of the fashion houses for which they were created. The remainder were packed up and shipped to his family home in Los Angeles, where they remained untouched and unseen. Perhaps the reason for this neglect that has followed is not just the fickleness of public attention, but the fact that Viramontes, as he always signed his work, was an artist who chose to make his career and earned his subsequent reputation and celebrity in the rarefied world of fashion and haute couture. He was that rare and all but extinct beast, a fashion illustrator. Fashion illustration today does not enjoy the key role it did during its heyday in the 1940s and 50s, when glossy magazines were filled with stylized sketches of rather startling-looking women. I'm sorry, I'm a bit backed up on the images. These are some images of the research where we were actually going through the diaries and the family archives, and also at Valentino's chateau in the south of France. He had a very big collection of Tony's work, so we traveled there to photograph the drawings and also some of the sketchbooks where he recorded the people he met, who he found interested, and he asked them to write notes about themselves. But to go back to my point, fashion illustration back in the day was very different. The images of women were very startling and stylized. But by the time Tony made his debut in 1979, fashion illustration had not been fashionable for some time. Yet his images are as fresh and compelling now as they were nearly 30 years ago. And a large part of the impetus behind this book was to put his name back out there, because no history of fashion illustration could be complete without recognizing the contributions of Tony Viramontes. Frank Anthony Viramontes was born on December the 8th, 1956, in Santa Monica, California, to Anita and Frank Viramontes. Both parents were the offspring of first-generation Mexican immigrants. His mother's family hailed from Guanajuato, while his parents were from a small town called Tequila. Tony's parents were members of the careful lower middle classes. Frank was a machinist for the McDonnell Douglas Aircraft Company, and Anita worked for the telephone company. Home was Belliot Avenue, located in the suburbs of West Los Angeles, where Tony's parents provided him with a good Catholic upbringing and an idyllic all-American childhood. He was the third of four siblings, his older brothers Manuel, Ed, and Ralph. Frank and Anita were extremely supportive and nurturing of all of their boys, despite their very obvious differences. While Manuel, Ed, and Ralph were athletic, Tony exhibited a very strong artistic streak and spent most of his time drawing. He began by documenting his brother's football games and progressed to the bullfights he attended with his parents. Tony was about 10 years old when his parents began taking him to bullfights in Tijuana, Mexico. The bull ring, located on a street called Revolution, was in the middle of the town, and it once drew Hollywood starlets like Marilyn Monroe and Ava Gardner to its stands. Tony found the sense of pomp and pageantry around the ring intoxicating, and while his family watched the fight unfold, he would sketch the performance. Even in childhood, Viramontes had an eye that missed nothing and pieced together his perceptions in a highly personal way. Years later, he recalled in detail the brightly colored gilt-edged costumes of the toreadors, the rush of the music, the passion of the crowd. It was also beautiful, he said, a complete source of artistic inspiration. Tony's early choice of subject was to prove symptomatic of his later love of fashion and the way in which his eye was drawn magpie-like to glittering surfaces. For by his teens, Tony's drawings were dominated by women. The fashion illustrator Antonio Lopez had become one of his biggest inspirations, and he began persuading high school friends to model for him. After school, Viramontes attended the Art Center College of Design in Pasadena. It was here that one of his instructors, Paul Jasmine, told him that if he wanted to study fashion illustration seriously, he should go to New York. 2 years later, he moved, first attending the Fashion Institute of Technology, then alternating classes at Parsons School of Design and the School of Visual Arts. The next few years were extremely productive for Tony, and he made many of the friends with whom he would later team up professionally. Through model Janice Dickinson, he met makeup artist Way Bandy, from whom his diary notes he learned a lot about style and sophistication. Bandy, in turn, introduced him to the model Tina Chow, who had already established herself as one of Antonio's house models. She forged the link between Tony and his boyhood hero, then at the height of his fame as an illustrator. Antonio took a shine to Tony and acted as his mentor, offering advice, recommendations, and passing on the occasional job. He also advised him to study with his former teacher, Jack Potter, whose class Drawing and Thinking had become a staple at the School of Visual Arts, where he was to teach for some 45 years. This was a no-nonsense class. Potter, who had been a friend of Carl Erickson and championed the work of the René's Bouet and Gros, had a dictum that the lines his students drew should not be sort of, kind of, or maybe, but straight, curved, and fluid. He maintained that once you walked into room 502, you were in his world, which by all accounts was a throwback to the 1950s, when he himself had received coveted commissions from Pond's, Cosmopolitan, and Coca-Cola. He perpetuated the old guard upper crust wasp style of drawing in which he himself had been trained. His models were stiff and the poses dated. It was not a come draw a pretty model class, it was a thinking class. You were challenged to think before you drew. A classmate of Tony's told me that while most of Jack's students were still formalizing their style, Tony already seemed ahead of the pack and was in touch with what was or wasn't right for his vision. He stayed only a few semesters, but for the first time he had a major artistic breakthrough. Tony's work had always been precise, reflecting the type of drawing he'd done in high school. But as he began to trust his own instincts, his style became less literal. "I'm really trying to see and not to stylize so much," he wrote in his diary, "to really look before I draw." More to his liking, and certainly more influential on both his personal and artistic development, were Stephen Meisel's classes at Parsons. Stephen Meisel, who had worn only black since leaving high school, cut an impressive and enigmatic figure. Although only 2 years older than Tony, he had already began to make his mark as an illustrator at Women's Wear Daily, where he worked alongside veteran fashion artist Kenneth Paul Block. To boost his earnings, Meisel taught a drawing class 2 nights a week at Parsons, where he himself had studied. Stephen's classes were exhilarating. He was the polar opposite of Jack Potter. He allowed his students to see how wonderful fashion could be. He made you feel it. Mizell, a self-confessed fashion junkie since childhood and today a renowned photographer, was one of the few teachers who combined an understanding of the old fashion championed by Potter with a know-how how to translate it into now fashion. The models he used in his classes were either friends such as Lisa Rosen, Terry Toy, and Stephen Sprouse, or other students. There was none of the usual art school models who were older and had been around for years. Mizell would style the models himself, often playing with gender, putting a girl in a suit and tie or a man in wig and heels. The poses were fun and quirky and exaggerated. Mizell encouraged extreme viewpoints and would sometimes pose himself. He created a real sense of urgency in the room. If he liked what a student was doing, he would grab the drawing before they were done and pin it to the wall. The goal of each student was to get on the wall. Tony's drawings were almost always on the wall. Mizell's class was the catalyst for Tony to refine his craft and cut to the chase. He developed a much looser style of drawing. His line became a little more trenchant, as an early painterly style, albeit a strikingly contemporary one, gave way to simple outlines and minimal marks. Stephen made me loosen up, wrote Tony in his diary. I was seeing a lot of Kenneth Paul Block's work in women's wear daily, and it was a faster, much easier style for me to work in, a little bit looser, slightly imperfect, finished but not polished, or polished but not finished. Through Mizell, Tony's presence became more visible. Stephen was his passport to the inner circle of Manhattan's demi-mondaine, with all its social hierarchies and cliquishness. Evenings were spent in the pursuit of fabulousness amongst the denizens of the Mud Club or on the dance floor at Studio 54. The downtown dress code demanded humor and ingenuity. Sartorial radicalism of any kind was encouraged. The clean-cut appearance Tony had favored when he began taking classes at Parsons gradually gave way as he spent more time with Mizell, and he developed a look that would last the rest of his life, dressing almost exclusively in black, from the polish on his fingernails to the drindle skirts over his jeans. After graduation, Viramontes remained in New York, where he caught the attention of the Japanese couturier Hanamori, who advised him to go to Paris, where she herself had an atelier. But he hung on in New York doing small ad campaigns for Bergdorf Goodman and Calvin Klein. But as Tony's profile began to rise, his problems multiplied. Often his drawings were discarded or changes were requested. Even when his drawings did run, he grew increasingly upset about the way they were used. In 1982, he took Maury's advice, and like so many fashion illustrators before him, he left for Paris. Paris agreed with Tony, and commissions from Marie Claire and Prosper Asseline's illustrated Bible, La Mode en Pointure, quickly came his way. He soon traded his small studio in the 5th arrondissement for a grand third-floor apartment in the fashionable Avenue de Saxe. Life ran at a hot pace as he proved he could handle editorial, advertising, and portraiture commissions with equal ease. And in 1983, Viramontes began to draw the Parisian haute couture, then at an apex of opulence and the source of some of the world's most dramatic and splashy high fashion. The flamboyance of the moment was a perfect fit for his vocation. Fashion swung his way as the hard outlines, bold colors, and overt glamour all lent themselves to his pen and paintbrush. Viramontes reported on each season's collections with wit and originality, rapidly amassing the kind of distinguished commissions more frequently earmarked for photographers. From La Mode and Marie Claire in France, to Vogue and Perley in Italy, to Tatler and Cosmopolitan in London. His work soon populated the pages of all the best fashion publications. Indeed, several glossy tomes described Viramontes as the new savior of fashion illustration. He was an unusual illustrator, remembers Vogue Italia editor Franca Susani. He had a very strong hand. At a time when photography dominated the fashion pages, it's difficult to imagine the power that an artist could have in the interpretation of the moment. Viramontes reinvigorated a traditional way of selling fashion through drawing. He reminded people of what the hand had been able to achieve before it was sidelined by the eye of photography. Pioneering new directions to shake up the viewer, Tony developed his style continuously and became a master of diverse drawing techniques and media. Pencil, charcoal, ink, gouache, and collage. Occasionally, he even used lipsticks, eyebrow pencils, and makeup. Tony's drawings were successful because they were completely contemporary. Just when the realism of photography seemed to have triumphed over drawing, Viramontes, with lines as lean as his elongated models, succeeded in bringing fashion illustration back to the foe. His position as the crown prince of the painted page was confirmed towards the end of 1984, when he was summoned to Rome by the couturier Valentino Garavani. To mark 25 years to his best-dressed clientele, the designer commissioned Viramontes to create a portfolio of drawings. It was an inspired pairing. Valentino, the sheikh of chic, bewitched by any kind of frilly, frothy detail, and Viramontes, the enfant terrible of fashion illustration. The intricacies of Valentino's gowns inspired Viramontes to create some of his most defiantly high-fashion images. The clothes were so complex to draw, it was almost like an exercise, and Tony's previously undernourished palette flared into a kaleidoscope of colors during the commission. He relished the superb detailing of the couturier's gowns, the bows and ruffles, the embroideries. Effortlessly, he draws our attention to the essence of Valentino's extravaganzas, suggesting the texture of a chiffon, the luster of a bead, or the shimmer of a satin, all with an economy of expression that grows increasingly vague until gradually the details disappear. While the drawings push the edge of sex and sexuality, they remain very much about elegance and sophistication. For no matter how outre the final composition, Tony's drawings always had the sound technical underpinnings of a conspicuously gifted draftsman. The singular attitude and style that emerged in Tony's fashion drawings was impossible to ignore and impossible to duplicate. It would make him as influential a fashion illustrator as any from the preceding generations. Just as René Gruot's work reflects the confidence and elegance of the upper classes in the 1940s and 50s, Viramontes' images perfectly capture the younger, fashionable woman of the 1980s. Rather than simply flaunting her femininity, she has an air of insolence. Each of Tony's girls were confident and aloof, nonchalant, even a little haughty. You only need to see a face once to know it's a Viramontes face, a Viramontes model. They were not pretty faces. They were strong, with a full mouth, a prominent nose, and a graphic brow. There was a diabolical grace in what Viramontes drew. He focused subtly and delicately on what made a woman different or unusual. Indeed, while women took the reins in his drawings, the so-called weaker sex becoming the stronger one, the image of the masculine role was also reversed. At a time when Ralph Lauren and Calvin Klein were peddling an image of Ivy League sobriety, Viramontes was stretching the bounds of masculine identity. Tony relished recreating typically macho men into softer, more feminine images. His sensuously female men frequently cast off their traditional functional uniforms and become props or accessories in his drawings. Shining with grace and charm, they assumed seductive poses as they gazed saucily in the viewer's direction. Tony's career went from strength to strength as he traveled between Paris, Tokyo, Milan, and Germany. But gradually, the artist in Viramontes was bridled at the conventions of fashion. When writer Nicholas Drake came calling in 1984, Viramontes was keen to shake off the label and associations of the commercial artist, insisting that he was an artistic creator, a creator of images and ideas. "I'm sort of in a transitional period in my life," he wrote in his diary. "I don't want to be doing what I'm doing now forever. Illustration is a bridge, a crossing, to lead me to other areas. I also want to get into video." Restless and dissatisfied, Viramontes needed continual stimulation. "I look for new ideas because I always want to be in a state of creative anxiety and insecurity. If I feel sure of myself, I cannot be creative. I tried to renew myself. To that end, he began to experiment with photography, picking up a camera for the first time since high school. London-based stylist Ray Petrie also encouraged Viramontes to explore a new agenda outside of Paris fashion. Petrie was a stylist long before the term became a fashionable job description, and was at the epicenter of British street style. He mixed classic high-end designer pieces with streetwear in a natural but haphazard manner, at a time when fashion was all about shoulder pads and power dressing. He became an important source of work for Tony in London and allowed him to break free from the glossy Condé Nast titles like Vogue and Tatler and experiment in the pages of The Face and ID. Around this time, Tony also began to experiment more heavily with drugs. He had always dabbled, but his habit quickly went from being very private and contained to public and all-consuming. He began to burn a lot of bridges in Paris. He became a bit of a diva, arriving late, asking for the impossible. But he was still artistic enough to be respected despite the hysteria and hang-ups. When Tony was at his peak, he was the toast of Paris. He was creating a new road, and people respected that. The dramas were part of the parcel and were accepted by frequently insecure clients who hired him because he had an eye and he had the buzz. But Tony had his own set of rules, and if you wanted him but did not understand him, you were in for a rough ride. Tony was adept at getting his own way when it came to dealing with art directors and clients alike. When he realized he was not going to get his way, his calling card was to create absolute mayhem. But for a lot of people, it was to be the first and last time they used him. But for others like Hannah Mori and Claude Montana, Tony was given unprecedented freedom and created some of his most memorable images. This is a piece he created for Hannah Mori for an editorial. And this was for Claude Montana, with whom he had a very successful working relationship. As the 80s rolled on, Tony's frenetic pace gradually began to take its toll, and he began losing his hair. His doctor told him to slow down, that he'd been pushing himself too hard, but his symptoms showed little sign of abating. And towards the end of 1986, Viramontes was diagnosed with HIV and was seriously ill. This was the decade when sex turned deadly, as did the drugs that fueled the rivalry. The party that had begun so effortlessly in Paris lost its energy, and the hangover kicked in. After completing a cover story with Nina Hagen for German Vogue, Viramontes left Paris and returned to his family home in Los Angeles, where he worked sporadically, creating the sleeve art for Janet Jackson's groundbreaking album Control, as well as a few smaller projects with the Motels and Donna Summer. His condition had rendered him unreliable for extended periods, and gradually his work appeared with increasing irregularity. Tony Viramontes died of AIDS on the 23rd of May, 1988. He was 31. For all too brief a period, Viramontes became the voice of fashion, or at least its timekeeper. While it's tragic that Tony's life ended with the same speed at which he worked, more than 2 decades after his death, the magic of his art has not faded with time, and those achingly effortless marks, each stroke dead on perfection, are a lasting testament to a career whose memory should always be on the ascent. Thank you. Does anyone have any questions? Yes?
So you discovered a lot of his work through his family.
Yes.
Did the material stay in the possession of the family, or has it migrated to a normal repository?
Well, Tony got sick in Paris, so his family took him back to Los Angeles. And after he died, they went back to Paris, and they brought everything back to California, and they stored it in the garage. So it had just been there basically for 25 years. And that's the work that I kind of went through. And we organized a traveling exhibition to coincide with the publication of the book. And a lot of fashion houses have bought sketches that relate to their work. So Jean-Paul Gaultier has bought quite a few of the drawings, Valentino, Stephen Jones. So lots of them are now with the designers, but quite a few of them have also been sold to fund his mother's medical care. So there's no formal archive. It's diminishing all the time as I speak. Anyone else?
Does anyone else have any questions? If you do, it'd be great if you talked in here because we're recording the event.
From all the places that you have shown, I mean, you have presented the book, which of the countries do you think they have been more of response to the work of Tony Viramontes?
Well, I think it was very well received in Shanghai, which I really wasn't expecting. We had an absolutely enormous turnout to the exhibition opening, and it really was overwhelming. I think there were 2,000 people in total. It was enormous. And for some reason in Germany, people really respond to his work quite well. It's sort of, I don't know why, but we got a huge amount of press in Germany for the book. But Shanghai was definitely the most overwhelming in terms of turnout and response.
Anyone else? Anyone?
As I said before, I really love your website, but I noticed that you sell certain things and that they're in pounds. So I'm assuming you sell through London, but can people
Oh
from
yes,
anywhere buy?
we sell drawings all over the world. We sell both edition prints of illustrators' work, including Tony's, but we also sell the original artwork too. So we send things everywhere from Australia to the Philippines and Bangkok to Paris. So it's global.
So I know he was a contemporary of Antonio Lopez. So did they continue to work together, or what
They never
happened
really
to
worked
Antonio?
together. When Antonio really was at his peak, when Tony was just starting, he was already incredibly well established. But he was always very keen to help students who would come to his studio. So he would offer him advice. He suggested he study with Jack Potter because it was a very grounded, disciplined class. But he would also pass on jobs that he really didn't want to do himself to Tony. So he introduced him to Prosper Asseline. Prosper was just starting his magazine at the time, and he couldn't really afford Antonio. So he settled for Tony. And Tony did about 7 or 8 issues of the magazine with the most incredible drawings. At the Paris Haute Couture, he drew furs, and he drew things for Chanel. So, but they were very good friends, and I think that Antonio died a little bit after Tony. Tony died first.
Thank you.
Anyone else? Anyone? Okay, so Dean will be available to sign books, and we have a special discount on the books. 30%? 30% off the books today, so if you want to have him sign the book, that would be wonderful. And then next up, we'll have Sass Brown speaking about eco-fashion and upcycling of fashion. Thank you. Stick around.